There is an amazing power in walking. And I think when you do that day after day, it's very, very simple, essential human tasks that you've pared back life to its most simple. And it's incredibly therapeutic.
I've been looking forward to this conversation, mostly because I'm actually super curious about what you've done for most of your adult life, working as a diplomat, representing Queen and country.
My career allowed me to brush shoulders with some incredibly successful and wealthy folk. It's a vocation, it becomes your life. I mean, you live and breathe the organisation, particularly when you're overseas. But I had always said that I'll do this for as long as I'm enjoying it, for as long as I believe in it. You know, you don't have to stay on the same track. I like to think you can do things in a different way and you can live life differently. My dad is now in care. They diagnosed him with Alzheimer's disease. And so I thought, well, this is the moment to try something new. And I went to see some friends actually. One of them just said to me, well, you should go for a walk from one end of the country to the other. I like the outdoors and I like hiking, but you know, you go for a day hike.
Yeah, never a multi-day activity spanning months.
No. And so my first response was, why would I do that? That's insane. But when you're out walking and you do that day after day, it's amazing how all those sort of thoughts in your own head are calmed and quietened. I mean, maybe when I started out, I sort of thought, I'm going to find the answer. And what the walk taught me, I think, is that doesn't matter.
Recently, this podcast celebrated its first birthday, and I'm incredibly proud of the foundations that I've laid in the first set of episodes. I want to thank you so much for listening. It means so much and has given me confidence to know this is something that can continue going forward. And as the podcast evolves, I want to make sure it can be sustainable for the future. And part of that evolution will inevitably include some form of commercial partnership. It's still very early days and it may take some time, but this is something I want to explore in the podcast's second year. Until then, I might try and be a bit creative and experiment with a few things. Some of it may work, some of it may not, so do bear with me. I live a nomadic lifestyle, and I'm never in one place for too long. So from time to time, I find it very convenient to order groceries in the form of a Gusto box. I've been using Gusto for nearly 5 years now. It's a delivery company that sends you fresh food and all the ingredients you need to cook delicious meals at home, along with very easy to follow recipe cards. They have over 90 recipes every week, so there really is something for everyone. And so many of their recipes I've returned to again and again because their meals are just delicious. I've got a referral code. I've shared it with so many of my friends. It means they get cheap groceries on their first few boxes and I get credit in return. I'll link it below. Use it to sign up and you get a pretty hefty discount off your first box. There's no subscription required and you can order just one box whenever you want. Thank you, Patrick, for joining me. I've been looking forward to this conversation, mostly because I'm actually super curious about what you've done for most of your adult life, representing the UK, working as a diplomat, some of it for the Foreign Office, representing Queen and country across the globe on a global scale, promoting everything the UK stands for, meeting political leaders, business icons, pop stars as well.
Occasionally, yeah.
Let's talk, if you don't mind, a bit more about that version of your life. It's not something you do now, but it was a big part of your adult life, right?
Yeah, I mean, I joined what was then the Foreign and Commonwealth Office a year or so after university. I went travelling first after I graduated and then came back and applied for the Foreign Service and went through a months-long recruitment process and was miraculously managed to get offered a job. So so I joined the Foreign Office back in 1993 now, and the Foreign Office has this approach when it takes people on. Basically, you are dropped in the deep end. There was like a 3-week induction about the basics of the office and and your contract and your terms and all those sorts of basic things, but you then you're dropped into a job and you learn on the job. And so I was my first job was Thailand and Cambodia desk officer. So I was the person in London in a department covering the whole of Southeast Asia, who was responsible for our relationship with those countries, Thailand and Cambodia, which Thailand in particular, a massive tourist destination, of course. Lots of Brits even then were going to Thailand on holiday and could get themselves into difficulty, as some people do. So there were some tricky cases around that. But it was also about the trade relationship. I mean, promoting or helping British companies access the Thai market for their products, and also encouraging Thai companies to invest in the UK. And in many ways, like any other office job, I was responding to letters from the public if they had issues relating to Thailand, whatever it might be, the politics, or they got into trouble as a tourist, or people could be writing to their MP about issues that were of concern to them. And of course, those MPs' letters get sent into the Foreign Office. That's the part of the government that deals with foreign affairs. And we have to draft a response for the minister then to send back to their colleague in Parliament, and so on. So fascinating job, a real baptism of fire, I guess. As I say, you just get dropped into the job.
And am I right in thinking there's a certain type of person who generally works as a diplomat?
That's a good question. It clearly appeals to people who...
why I say that, because you were someone who was slightly different.
Yeah.
From your own background.
Yes.
From your father working in a factory, and not necessarily coming from this high-class privileged background with money and estate schools.
Yeah, of all government departments, I guess the Foreign Office and probably the Treasury have been the most traditional, and they had historically recruited people from certainly the professional classes and the more privileged classes. Going a long way further into the past to the sort of early 20th century, unless you had a private income, you couldn't afford to be a diplomat. That's the way it was. And so clearly it had developed quite a lot when I joined, but it was still pretty much everybody in there was from at least a professional class background and had been to Oxford or Cambridge and or public school, and usually both. So
this wasn't your background.
This wasn't my background at all. No, and at the time, the Foreign Office was trying to be more diverse. There was a definite effort by the government as a whole, but also the Foreign Office, which, as I said, had been that sort of very traditional sort of place, to bring in a broader cross section of people. And so I guess I benefited from that. That was certainly and most obviously the case at the sort of graduate recruitment sort of level. They did take on people in more support roles, which were not from those privileged classes, if you like. Support staff and people at a more junior level, they were just from normal families. But at the graduate level, I was quite unusual, shall we say. And so that was a culture shock as well. When you go into an organisation that is so different to your own background. And just the physical building, the Foreign Office is in, which overlooks Downing Street in Whitehall in London. It's like a massive stately home, really. And so if you went to anybody's senior's office, it's like going to a National Trust property, not being in an office environment. And indeed, some former colleagues very recently, but they released a report only a few weeks ago, sort of suggesting, I think partly for sort of clickbait, but just to make a point, is the building is an issue in that, if you're going to be a modern, sort of diverse organisation that attracts a cross section of the public, does that sit well with this sort of monolithic building that was basically constructed in the 19th century at the height of empire to impress and intimidate foreigners? It's a sort of quite an interesting concept.
You had a career in that world for 25 years. If you could, in a nutshell, just explain kind of where that took you over those years, because you've actually been based in different countries as well.
Yeah, the life of a diplomat basically alternates between being in London, where you're alongside the government. You're ultimately a civil servant working for the government, so just like any other department of state. But of course, you've got the international angle to it. So we staff embassies and consulates around the world. So After my stint in a couple of years in London when I first started, I ended up in Morocco, a very small embassy at the time. Then I came back to London and I spent quite a long time in London, partly because I applied and managed to get a job acting as private secretary, we call it, to the Foreign Secretary, first being Robin Cook and then Jack Straw in the early 2000s. Huge job, incredibly privileged job to have that sort of close access to the foreign minister.
Both of those names as well seem like they're very respected politicians who didn't have too much of a bad name against themselves.
Yeah, I mean, they were it was a slightly different era to now, perhaps, but yeah, they both were very, very different individuals. Robin Cook, probably one of the brightest people I have ever come across. I mean, the just an incredibly impressive brain and an ability to analyze and absorb information, which came with its own challenges because he was a man who I guess enjoyed his own company most, and there were perhaps few people who could match his intellect. So he could be quite impatient at times, I think it's fair to say. Jack Straw, an incredibly polished and professional politician, incredibly good at working the political system and understanding who he should make connections with and who he should get to know, and also a huge ability to connect with normal people as well. So just sort of the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of politicians, I guess. So yeah, it was fascinating to work for them, and that was during my time with Robin Cook, it was the sort of the petering out, the end of the conflicts that had been going on in the Balkans, and then with Jack Straw, 3 months after he was in office, began his time as Foreign Secretary. We had 9/11, where everything changed in a nanosecond, and that led to Afghanistan, and then before you know it, we were at war in Iraq, and so yeah, it was a fascinating time and a brilliant but exhausting job as well, as you can imagine.
What year did you come out of being a civil servant?
Out of being a civil servant, 2018. Yeah.
So how do you compare your job being in that political environment then to what is the political environment that's happened since? Because a lot has happened since 2018.
Yes. I think a lot had started before 2018 too, which were parts of the reason I decided to step away. We'd had 2016 EU referendum in this country. We'd had the 2016 presidential elections in the US, which Donald Trump won.
Were you working at the US embassy then?
Well, I'm working at the British embassy in the US, of course. Yeah.
Sorry. The embassy in the US in Washington.
Yeah. So I was. It's one of our biggest embassies in the world, as you would imagine, because the relationship.
So you saw that all unfolding on a day-to-day, but you were absorbed in that world of the president.
Totally. Yeah. So my period in Washington.
That must have been hard. That must have been really hard. Yes, in some ways. But absolutely fascinating as well. And hard and disturbing. Well, did you know?
Did I know
that Trump would be president in 2016? It was never a certainty, but I don't think I realised until speaking to some Americans afterwards how much they hated Hillary Clinton, or a large proportion of that population.
Yeah, it's very easy I think, for people to look with hindsight and say, the number of people who say, including some colleagues who say, oh yes, it was quite clear that Trump was going to win. It was clear that he was resonating with a significant proportion of Americans. And America is is a very divided country, and it has been for a very long time. I mean, if you look, broadly speaking, of course there's nuances to this, but if you look at a map of America, the East and West Coast vote Democrat, and the rest votes Republican. Now, as I say, there are some nuances to that, of course, and when presidents change from one political party to another, they're fighting over a tiny amount of swing states in some of these places. But broadly speaking, your urban East Coast and West Coast are Democrat, and the rest is Republican. So Trump was appealing to a large swathe of the population, but I mean, I certainly wasn't sure it would be enough. Did my own sort of political views have an impact on that? Maybe. But I still find it hard to, I mean, Trump is standing for election again this time and still has an incredible body of support. I still find that hard as a rational human being to understand why that's the case. At the same, I can already hear people going, well, it's really easy to understand. Well, it is uneasy to understand in some ways. It's easy to understand why in this country we have taken a sort of swing to the populist side of politics. In some ways, you can say, we were hit by an economic crisis in 2008 for the first time in a very long time, certainly 20 or 30 years. People were looking at the prospect of their children being poorer than them or having less opportunities than them for the first time in a long time. And when people feel under pressure, people promising simple solutions to their problems can be appealing. So in that sense, it's understandable. But when you look at what Trump was actually saying, and indeed now we have the evidence of his 4 years in office and what he actually did, I find it very hard to understand why people would still conclude that sort of populist wing of our politics is the answer to the problems we have. But everybody has their political views to which they're entitled. And
I think you're talking about certain things that he swore on oath he wouldn't do and then did do, or swore on oath he wouldn't do but then did do.
Well, and things he also didn't do that he said he was going to do. I mean, Trump was going to make America great again. I mean, he didn't. I mean, he said he was going to stop people coming over the southern border. He didn't. He said he was going to solve the Middle East peace process. It was the easiest problem ever for him, and he was going to solve it within a matter of weeks. He didn't, because these things are difficult and complicated. So it's not just the things he did that are a bit shocking, and there's quite a lot of that. But it's the things he said he was going to do and he'd do very easily, and he then didn't do anything of the sort and actually made things worse in many cases. So, I don't want to give the impression by saying all this that I think Britain is immune from this. We're clearly not. We've done it in a very British way, but we started this conversation over a question of sort of how did you, what's changed since you left? And I think, in a way, what's happened in this country is a parallel to what's happened in the US. It's just with different personalities.
Yeah, I was going to come on to this. I've got this down to talk about, and if you don't mind, let me kind of put my 2 cents in first. I watched a lot of John Oliver. Did you watch Last Week Tonight?
Yes, he's brilliant.
He is brilliant. And for those who don't know, he's a British-born comedian, but he's now an American citizen on a green card. And he is a very successful comedian over there. He worked on The Daily Show under Jon Stewart, was an incredible, reporter, but for a comedy show, reporting on American politics. He famously did a really good 3-part piece on gun control and comparing it to Australia when after their first mass shooting, they got rid of all their guns. And so he just used that as a comparison to what's going on in the USA. And I've been a huge fan of his program, and I watch it very regularly, even though a lot of it is American politics. Stuff that doesn't sometimes influence me, but I subscribe to him. And over the years, he has been eroding that American dream that's painted, I guess, in all of us because of the American brand that we witness in films and TV series, in like culture, this image of the great American way. And it's made me realize that America is flawed fundamentally in its heart. And it has so many deep problems to the point where I, at the moment, have not found a peace in visiting that country, because I don't know why I should put any money into a system which I don't believe is looking after its own human beings. Much to the same would be the same reason why I wouldn't go visit Russia, because I wouldn't want to put any money in their system and support that side. And that's really given me quite a negative and strong opinion on America. I hope I can find some peace with it. I have a sister who lives out there who I have visited in the past, but since my kind of mindset has been changed a little bit, I haven't found the peace of actually going over there and just being like, oh, isn't America great? Because it isn't. And, you know, some of those reasons are electing Donald Trump as a president. It's quite obviously their complete lack of any gun control. And to give you some context, my sister moved over there 8 years ago with her 3 kids who were all different ages, but they all had to go to a new school in America. This is over in California. And one of them is over at the moment studying at university over in the UK. And had a conversation with her recently, and she said, me and the two of her two of the siblings, all 3 of them individually in different ages, at different stages of school, different year groups of school, individually all know a child in their school that's been shot.
Wow.
And that hit me hard. And it hit me hard even learning when they first went over to school that they were having to do drills where they had to practice what happens when a person comes into the school with a gun. I do not believe that should be something that's ever put into a school. And there's so easily a solution to all those problems. And I find it really hard to support a country that's not even going to support its own citizens by doing the right thing. Also, the problems they have with their healthcare, recently overturning Roe v. Wade. And I know that you've said that these viewpoints aren't politics. It's about protecting the fundamentals of democracies. That when politicians say what they're going to do something, we hold them accountable to it, especially when they do a U-turn. And so much of what I've talked about in America, I think you described as the American disease. But you also, and you're just alluding to this before I kind of interrupted, you have drawn parallels with the fact that we have plenty of it in the UK too.
Yeah, I mean, before we turn back to the UK, let me just say a bit about the US. So, you know, I wrote a book about this. It was the first thing I did after I stepped away from the Foreign Office in 2018 and left the US. I'd spent almost 5 years at our embassy there. But I did an exchange to the US between school and university. I spent half a year in California and then traveled around. I've, you know, spent my whole career working with Americans. I've traveled there a lot. And despite having been in an embassy for 5 years, a very busy embassy, and of course we're reporting back to London about what's happening and you know, working on everything with the Americans from sort of trade policy and, you know, trying to, at that point, sort of, what do we do about the Iran nuclear program and how do we stop the war in Syria? And, you know, on everything that crosses the government's desk, we would be working with the Americans. But I felt that there was a sort of a deeper piece that I wanted to write about how I saw America. And I'm a huge fan of the US. It's been an important part of my life. The American people, I know this is a sweeping generalization, but are the nicest, kindest, welcoming, dynamic people you could possibly meet. And it's an incredibly stunning country. I mean, it's half a continent, really. And so there is everything. Their national parks are just amazing. So it's a wonderful place. And importantly, America's success is absolutely critical to us. It's critical to the West because they are, for the time being, the world's superpower, and the world is changing extremely quickly now. Where China is rising rapidly. We see with Putin's invasion of Ukraine that Russia is again sort of much more active than it certainly has been since the sort of end of the Cold War. We've got India changing incredibly quickly. So the world that that we were born into will be very different within a generation or two. And in my view, if we want the sort of Western approach, the democratic approach to survive and thrive, we need a strong and successful USA. Without that incredibly wealthy, powerful country doing well on our side, we're going to have serious issues. So what I wrote about was sort of the things that you alluded to. And the book is called The Great American Delusion. We're not really here to talk about that today, but as it came up, and the basic premise is that lots of Americans still believe their own propaganda. That sense of the America being the greatest democracy on the planet, the most successful economy on the planet, that anybody can come to America and make it the American dream. Those things are fraying at the edges if they haven't broken already. Believe it or not, and bearing in mind my data is now from when I wrote the book in 2018, social mobility in the US was lower than it was in most of the rest of Europe, including the UK. So your chances in the US of starting off in a working class, relatively poor family and making it for yourself was less than it is in the UK or Germany or Spain or France. So the American dream is no longer delivering in the way it used to. And again, this points back to why we're seeing some of the problems we're seeing in the US and why populists like Donald Trump get support, because people feel that. People feel that day to day, that they don't see the prospects of their life getting better because that opportunity is no longer there. So, and then you mentioned their healthcare service, which, if you're wealthy, is incredible, amazing. You can get whatever you like. You can get the best treatments in the world, the most advanced drugs and so on. But if you're a normal person, unless you're in a job that's giving you a lot of healthcare coverage, you are going to either have massive bills or not have healthcare at all. Millions of people in the US don't have any healthcare at all. So what I wanted to write about is sort of, America in some ways is blinded by its own mythology and therefore isn't tackling some of the fundamental problems that exist. And if it doesn't, that's not just important for the US, it's fundamentally important for us as well in the rest of the West. So yeah, that. So I agree with you, but I would not write off the US to the same degree, because America has an incredible ability to reinvent itself. It's done many times over its relatively short history as a nation. And there is incredible innovation and dynamism. There's massive amounts changing in the US now with, President Biden trying to sort of onshore again lots of production of vital technologies that basically we'd contracted out to the Chinese to build. And so there's fundamental shifts happening already. And we need those to be successful, if we're honest. So yeah, but parallels to the UK, absolutely.
You mentioned government ignoring international law, breaking international agreements, threatening our right to protest, weakening the judicial security, trying to export migrants to a developing country, the disaster of Brexit, which you say is making us poorer, weaker and less respected around the world, which was also won on lies that are plastered on the side of a bus. We all know that story. And that politicians are pretending it's not bad when it really is.
Yeah. Should we talk about something positive?
I think I was just going back to John Oliver. He does obviously do some of the bigger UK stories, and I'm sure if there was a program that just focused completely on the UK, I'd have a similar mindset about all our own problems within our own core as well, which exists in every country in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot has changed in this country over the last 10 years or so. And, one thing I think is quite important is, after Trump was elected in the US, there was a massive investigation to Russian attempts to influence the election. And found very clearly that the Russians, and not just the Russians, but those countries that want the West to be less successful, had been very active in helping Donald Trump to get elected. Now, they're not doing that because they think that Donald Trump is the best and political leader for the US. They're doing it because they think that's the best outcome for them, because they know that it would increase the polarization in the US and in the West, and therefore distract and weaken their enemies. And, as I say, a huge amount of effort and a great deal of investigation went into this and showed that the Russians in particular were hugely active. We in this country have not had that investigation because it's not politically expedient for our current government, who backed Brexit, for it to be shown whether they were active or not. I mean, just by logic, I don't claim to have any insider knowledge on this, but just by logic, if Russia is being so active in the US to destabilize the West, we know historically that Russia has been active in destabilizing all sorts of parts of Europe, both in the Cold War and after. So why would it miraculously stop when Britain is becoming incredibly polarized and tearing itself apart over something like Brexit? Just doesn't. That just doesn't compute for me. But we haven't investigated it because it wasn't in the interest of our current government to investigate it. Whatever your politics, I think that's incredibly dangerous. We need to know what's going on so we can counter it, and try and stop it happening again in future. We know, for example, that the Russians over the years have put huge amounts of money into some of the extreme forms of activity around climate change. Not the sort of mainstream, people fighting to save the planet for all the right reasons, but the extreme fringes. Now, why would they do that? Maybe they want those extreme fringes really to wind people up, so people push back against those advocating for action against climate change. And why would they do that? Well, they might do that because they are massive exploiters of oil and gas, and they rely on that money to prop up their economy and their war activity in Ukraine. So, we know that that's been going on. So I guess sometimes people think, well, if Russia was interfering in X, it'd be really obvious. Like, let's do the American example again. If Russia was interfering in the American elections in 2016, it would be going around saying vote for Trump, or supporting people going around saying vote for Trump, vote for Trump, vote for Trump. They are much more subtle and skillful than that. That's too obvious. We'd spot that a mile off. What they do is, and we know this because the US looked at it in great detail, that they will find issues that they know resonate with people who are likely to be inclined or may be inclined to vote for Donald Trump, and amplify them so those people are outraged and mobilized to vote for Trump. They will then take action, for example, like amplifying stories in Black communities in the US about nobody ever listens to what you vote for. Nobody's ever delivered for what you vote for. No politician really cares about what's important to you. Why are they doing that? Because traditionally, African Americans in America have voted Democrat. And if you can dissuade them from voting, so they stay at home because they're convinced that politicians never do anything for them, that swings the support. That swings the pointer towards Donald Trump. So they're much more subtle. They're not. They don't. When our enemies are active in this country to destabilize, or in the US or in the West to undermine and destabilize our systems and our society, they're not doing it in direct and obvious ways because we'd spot it. They're much more subtle than that. So, we didn't look into that in the UK. I think that's a massive error. We need to know what's going on. We've got an election coming up that is going to be the most digital and social media election ever. Very few countries have done very much at all to regulate political activity on social media in a way that we know that activity is not skewing elections in one direction or another. And what does that do? That allows the bot farms that sit outside St. Petersburg with thousands of people working on behalf of the Russian state to sow discord and polarize society and stuff. They're active. They're out there, undoubtedly. And that's a real worry.
It's all incredibly complex and scary. I think I picked your brain enough on the world stage. Let's bring things back closer to home and move topic. I guess you mentioned a little bit about near the end of your tenure as a diplomat, how the political world was changing. And I think there's also other things in your personal life which was making you realise that you probably needed some kind of change. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, we've talked quite a lot about the sort of political context, if you like, and my own feeling that, the timing that I was coming to the end of my posting in Washington was just about the moment that all government effort was focusing on delivering Brexit, something, people are perfectly entitled to support, but I do not. I think will be seen as one of the most egregious acts of self-harm this country has done to itself, and we will feel the consequences for a very long time. I was coming to my end of my time in Washington. All likelihood was that, I would be redeployed into all the Brexit activity, something I don't believe in. And you have two choices as a civil servant. The British civil service is apolitical in the sense of it's your work. So, we elect politicians, so they represent a political party, but the civil servants working for them, when you're in your job, you leave your political views at the door and you provide advice and support to the government of the day. And when you've provided advice and the government decides what to do, you implement wholeheartedly what they've decided, whether or not you politically agree with that.
Oh, tell me what was happening also in your personal life at that time.
So my mum and dad came out to Washington quite a few times while I was there. And I remember one particular visit, probably about halfway in. So probably 2016, maybe, something like that. And just as my parents were about to leave, I was going to take them to the airport. I went upstairs to get my parents' suitcases and bring them down. And my mum was still up there. And she sat on the bed and said, "I'm really worried about your dad." Well, my first thought was, you've been here 3 weeks and I'm about to take you to the airport in the car with my dad. And this is the moment you choose to say, "I'm worried." And I guess my mum had probably been sort of building herself up to that point. And then sort of they're about to go home, so she should probably say something. And I think we'd all notice sort of slightly odd things in his behaviour, being a bit sort of forgetful, was one of them. The other thing was my dad had an incredible sense of direction always. When we were kids, this is obviously pre Google Maps and mobile phones and so on. And if he ever drove us anywhere, he'd look at a map work out the route, and pretty much just be able to do it and get us there, even somewhere completely new. And we joke about it. I was like, Dad, how do you know where we're going? And he said, my dad was always saying, I follow my nose. I know where I'm going. And he always would. And he started to get a bit lost. So that was really quite shocking, particularly to my mum, of course, because she's always relied on my dad because he was so good at finding places. And I guess that was the start of the sort of signs of that something wasn't right. And then, that deteriorated over time. And so by December 2017, he got into the system and I'd been to the doctor and had a number of tests over some time. And they diagnosed him with Alzheimer's disease. So that was a matter of weeks before I was due to leave Washington. And it was a massive blow. I mean, particularly for my mum and dad, obviously, who at this point have been married for over 50 years. It sort of felt like the wheels were coming off a bit, really. So I had plans to travel a bit after I finished Washington. I was owed some leave. It'd been so crazy through the election of Donald Trump and then his first year in office. But instead I came straight back and spent 10 days or so with my mum and dad, just sort of being around, doing loads of admin for them that my dad had done and that had sort of started to go a bit awry. And so, I guess that was just sort of one of those moments in life where you sort of think, okay, what does this mean? It just makes you stop and think a little bit about your own life as well, I guess. And so the fact of my dad's diagnosis, alongside that I was questioning whether I would want to be back in London working almost certainly on the government's priority of the day, Brexit, which I didn't believe in, I thought, well, maybe this is a time to do something different. And it wasn't the first time I'd thought about it. I mean, we talked right at the beginning about the Foreign Office, quite a traditional organisation, being very different. The people in the Foreign Office very different to my own background. And when I agonised about, when I got offered the job in the Foreign Office, I agonised about whether I should take it because I just didn't know whether I would fit in. Ultimately decided to take it thinking, well, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity and I should just grab it and see what happens. But I had always said that I'll do this for as long as I'm enjoying it, for as long as I believe in it, for as long as it's comfortable. So I'd always sort of had in the back of my mind, would I go and do something else? But just the sort of combination of my dad's diagnosis, what was going on politically in the UK, and my sense that I didn't particularly want to be involved in that made me sort of say, well, you don't have to stay on the same track all your life. I mean, typically lots of people do for all sorts of reasons, but I like to think you can do things in a different way and you can live life differently. And so I thought, well, this is the moment to try something new. And I'd like to say I had a massive plan, and that possibly would have been more sensible, but I didn't. It was just it was a very sort of personal sense of, no, this is the moment.
Just jumping in briefly to say, if you've got this far, you're probably a fan of the show. And it would be great if you wouldn't mind confirming that love by following or subscribing to this podcast. It takes just one click from you, but it really does make a huge difference in getting more people to find this show. Thank you. Just going back to the diagnosis, where you learned your dad had Alzheimer's, and it's something that's now you've experienced with him for many years. It's forever present in our society. Many people have their own experiences with it, but each one is so unique. What can you tell me about your experiences with your dad over the last few years?
I find it really hard to describe, I have to say, which isn't very helpful. But I find it really hard to describe because in many ways, it as you say, everybody's sort of experience of it is unique because there are different types of dementia, and people's symptoms are different. But I also think it's because it's basically a disease slowly destroying people's brains, then it's very person-centric because, the pathways that are breaking down in an individual's brain are their pathways. So, this may be totally medically wrong. It's just my own personal experience of it. But if somebody was quite an aggressive or tense or angry person before they had Alzheimer's, they may well have those symptoms amplified when Alzheimer's comes along, because it sort of, intensifies the personality. If the person pre-Alzheimer's was very calm, very subdued, they're more likely to be, in my view, someone with Alzheimer's in a more calm and subdued way. That doesn't take away from the fact that it's a brutal, cruel, and a horrible disease that slowly takes away people's ability to make decisions, to think, to control their own bodily functions. I think the thing I find frustrating about the way that we sometimes see Alzheimer's and dementia is people think it's a natural symptom of aging. As people age, people do become a bit more forgetful. It's like people need reading glasses because their eye muscles become less adept at adapting to different distances. It's things break down as we get older. But dementia is not normal aging. It's a disease. It's like a disease like anything else. But because I think we've had a tendency to think that, well, it's old people, Alzheimer's dementia is a symptom of aging, much less money has gone into researching the disease than goes into cancer or heart disease and so on. And yet, dementia is now the number one killer in most Western countries, including the UK. But it gets complicated because dementia isn't always put on the death certificate because people die of something else.
And so many people are undiagnosed.
And so many people are undiagnosed as well, yeah.
But we saw within COVID how quickly and effectively, if we all diverted our resources and money and energy into saving a global population, we could.
Yeah. And, we are, and there is more money going to research now. It's still nowhere near as much as we spend on other diseases, but it is increasing. It is becoming more a focus of attention. Indeed, David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister and I was in Washington, he hosted a dementia summit because, this is not just a disease that, leads to so many cruel and terrible personal stories. It's economically, it's a disaster because the impact on the economy of having growing numbers, millions and millions of people around the world, unable to contribute to society or live a fulfilling, independent life into their old age is enormous. It's enormous in the cost of caring. Much of that falls on individual family members at the moment, but on the care sector too, the costs are enormous. Absolutely staggeringly enormous. And so, I say that because I think it helps people who haven't been affected by Alzheimer's say, well, actually, this has a wider effect on society, and it really does. And the more we can spend on research and the more we can find ways to diagnose Alzheimer's earlier and earlier, and therefore as treatments develop, therefore they can be used and they can fundamentally change the course of people's lives, the better. My dad is now in care. He moved into care late last year. You try and do the planning. It's funny, I shouldn't really laugh, but when somebody has a diagnosis of dementia, there's quite a lot of advice out there, and there are wonderful organisations like Dementia UK, the Alzheimer's Society, and Alzheimer's Research, all sorts of information for people saying, plan now, make decisions now. Make sure you've got a will when you're still able to sign one. Make sure you do planning for the later years. Make sure you even, you look at future care needs. So, you don't wait until you get to a crisis point before you have to do this, because then it becomes more difficult. And despite all that advice, it's really hard to avoid having a crisis point. It really is, because, when a member of your family has Alzheimer's dementia, they're progressing gradually. And so everybody is desperately trying to keep things as normal as possible for as long as possible until it's not possible. And that point is a crisis point. And my dad ended up in hospital a couple of times, and then he didn't come out, and the whole system clicked into gear for what care does he need, how can it best be, and so on. So I only smile because for all our best efforts of let's avoid the crisis point, it's actually really hard to do with something like dementia. It gets to that point that everybody is emotionally wrung out, and difficult things are happening, and difficult decisions have to be taken about people's future care.
And I guess you've also got another side of it where you've got an individual who you may think believes in their best interest needs to go into care, but they might not see that either.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And that's hard, because you don't want to force someone to be living in a condition which they don't feel like they're comfortable in.
Yeah.
But sometimes, like you said, it does take an accident to happen.
Yeah, totally.
But you don't really want that to happen in your heart. You don't want someone to hurt themselves for them to realize they need the help.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if there's a blessing in Alzheimer is that, and dementia is that, for most people, their short-term memory is it just goes eventually. My dad can remember things from a very long time ago, but things that happened in the last minute or the last hour or the last couple of days, they're not there anymore. So actually, in my dad's case, when you got to the point that he needed care, I mean, how he may be aware in the moment that he's no longer at home, but then he'll forget. That comes with, that comes with all sorts of other issues, in that, anxiety and depression can be a quite serious conditions of Alzheimer's, because, if your brain isn't functioning properly anymore, and you're finding it hard to just even do basic things, who wouldn't be anxious? And if in those moments where you realize that something fundamental has changed, who wouldn't be depressed? So, it's a very complex disease. It's affecting the brain, so it's not surprising, and it's horrible to watch. It's absolutely horrible. There's no other way to describe it. At the moment, I when I go and see my dad, I take him out of his care home. He can still get about a bit, and he enjoys people watching. And people with Alzheimer's and dementia have an incredible affiliation with children, young children in particular, infants. I guess because it's simple and it reminds them of their own childhood, and as I say, their distant memories are still quite clear. And he loves just sort of sitting in a cafe and watching the world go by. But then every time I drive him back to the care home, he says, "Oh no, not there. Don't leave me there." It just breaks your heart.
Yeah, that must be so tough.
But then he will get to the door and he'll get out quite happily, and he'll be engaged with the carers in there who are wonderful, and so he's almost. It comes back to this short-term memory thing. He's almost forgotten what he said, 30 seconds ago when we drove into the car park. Don't take me there, and he's all right. But it's like a dagger to the heart every time it happens, and it's sort of, and that's for me. For my mum, you can only imagine what it must be like. So,
okay. Well, you wanted to help the cause and fundraise and do what you could to raise as much money for Alzheimer's Research UK by going on a grand adventure. You were talking about you being at this junction in life. You wanted change, didn't know what that was, but you had this, I guess, an option. Not an option. You had an opportunity to just do something completely different.
Yeah. So, I stepped away from the Foreign Office in 2018. I wrote a book about the US, and COVID hit, and I happened to be visiting my parents just before the sort of first lockdown, and as the announcement was made, and I was based in London still at the time, and as the announcement was made, my mum sort of said, "Well, do you have to go back? I'm not sure I can do this on my own with your dad." He was still at home at the time. And, why would you go back to a big city in the middle of a pandemic? So I stayed around to help. And I think we all thought it was going to be, 6 or 8 weeks, 3 months at the most. And then, before we knew it, it was 16 months before things really started opening up a bit again. I mean, of course, there'd been ups and downs over 2020, but, there was a long lockdown after Christmas 2020 into 2021 that only really started easing sort of in the late spring. And so by that point, I'd been sort of living in a caravan in my parents' back garden, seeing obviously my dad's Alzheimer's personally every day, and so still hadn't really. So I'd finished the book on America at this point. It had been published at the end of 2020, and so I was like, well, what do I do now? And I went to see some friends, actually. The first weekend we were allowed to move, which was sort of mid to late May 2021, and they're really good friends. And they said to me, one of them just said to me, well, you should go for a walk, a big walk. I was like, what? Yeah, you should go for a walk from one end of the country to the other.
You weren't on a walk at the time?
Well, I'd been to hikes,
Yeah.
I like the outdoors and I like hiking, but, you go for a day hike.
Yeah, never a multi-day activity spanning months.
No. I mean, I'd done a couple of days here and there in places, but nothing. And so my first response was, why would I do that? That's insane. But very quickly.
And why was that? What was in your mind that instantly dismissed that?
Well, it was going to be very hard work for a start. Right. It's quite a big undertaking. It's quite a long way from one end of the country to the other. I guess just the combination of where I was in my own life, having stepped away from, a job in the Foreign Office is so much more than a normal job. It's a vocation. It becomes your life. I mean, you live and breathe the organisation, particularly when you're overseas, because, not only are you doing an office job, a demanding office job, but you've got all sorts of evening commitments where, if a minister is visiting, you host them a dinner so they can meet people that are interesting to talk to, or you can do a bit more promoting of, their particular agenda point and so on, or you might be, at another embassy's event, or you might be at an event at the White House or wherever it might be, because that's what you do. So it becomes your whole life. So having stepped away from that, having my dad's, diagnosis and seeing it up close, and then having COVID and being sort of trapped, or everybody was locked down for so long, I just thought it slowly started just becoming, actually, this isn't a bad idea at all. And then the more I looked into it, the more I thought, no, this is a really good idea. This is, this would give me the time and the space to think about what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go next. It would, allow me to process, I hoped, more about, my dad and how that was going to work out over the next few years. And also, I could attach to that raising money for Alzheimer's research, which, as I said earlier, is, it hasn't got the attention that some other conditions have. And so, the more I could do, that seemed like a good thing to do. So if you like, those things sort of came together. But this point, it's mid-June.
Yeah, it's quite late in the season.
It's quite late in the season.
To start a big journey, yeah.
Yeah. So, I had 3 or 4 weeks really where, once I decided I was going to do it, I had to get my act together and get going.
There must be some beauty though in just getting an idea out there and not having that much time to get prepared, just to get yourself, set yourself this deadline that's like, okay, wow, got to act now.
Yeah.
Rather than just
absolutely.
be like, have this burning thing that's be like, well, I'll do it when the time is right, or when I'll wait for the next season when spring comes and I can start then. It's just, no, I think if I act now, I can get it done. So let's go.
Yeah. It's a good way of focusing the mind. I guess I've never been a big planner. I'm not one of those people who just sort of spontaneously goes and does something and flits from one thing to other. That's not me at all. But if something's decided, I want to get on with it. I'm not. I think you can overplan, and there are certain things you need to do, obviously, to be safe and all that stuff. But I was walking in Britain. This is a largely benign, temperate climate, and you're never that far from civilization, really. So,
and never that far from home.
And you're never that far from home.
Yeah,
exactly.
In emergency, the beauty of doing an adventure in your backyard. Yeah.
So I didn't want to overthink that, and also, some people, I guess, it depends what adventure you're doing, but some things you really do need to plan every single day and where you're going to be and where you're going to stay. But in somewhere like the UK, you don't need to do that. And also, actually, I was taking on something I'd never done before. So I really didn't know whether I was going to be walking 5 miles a day, 20 miles a day. So it's really hard then if I'd planned the route out in such great detail, you'd then actually feel, I think I would have felt constrained. No, I've got to get there today because that's where I said I was going to go. And that could be, one, it could be, not much fun. Two, it may even be too easy. If you planned it at sort of 7 mile days, then, once you've been walking for a couple of weeks, you'll have done that in 2 hours, or 3 hours. So I very much wanted to sort of develop it as I went along and be more flexible as I went along. So, I didn't have much choice. I did find a wonderful website that said when walking, you can get fit when you go along. And I thought, right, I'll go with that.
That's a great way to start. Yeah, and you can start small mileage and then build as you go. You don't have to start with the big mileage.
I didn't, but you can.
Right. Okay. Well, the length of Britain is such a common route. Typically, Land's End to John O'Groats is the tourist trail. But everyone puts their own little spin on it and has their own unique journey within that. You put your own uniqueness to that journey as well.
Yeah. Because I was doing the walk in part to raise money, I wanted to do something, a little bit different that might, gain a bit more interest and support. And so I did a load of scouring on the internet and I found somebody who'd walked from the southernmost point of Britain, which is Lizard Point, which is only, 3 days walking from Land's End, east of Land's End, and to Dunnet Head, which is the most northern point on the mainland, which is only a day's walk from John O'Groats. So because Land's End to John O'Groats is really arbitrary, it's just settlements at the furthest apart on the mainland, but they're not the most north, the most east, they're just sort of a bit arbitrary. So going from the most southern to the most northern felt nice. And then I also thought, well, there's two reasons for this. One, if I'm going to walk the length of mainland Britain, why wouldn't I go to Wales? Because that's one of the 3 countries that make up mainland Britain. Whereas actually lots of the routes don't, because it's a bit of a detour.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of the routes actually just dip into Wales along Offastyke a little bit before cutting through the Midlands and like Birmingham and Wolverhampton and those sorts of places before you get to the Peak District. But I was like, well, no, I want to see the whole country, and so let's add Wales. And then that got me thinking again, and I thought, well, I could do the 3 peaks on the way, so I have to go into Wales to climb Snowdon, and then I'd have to detour off the route north to go and do Scafell Pike in the Lake District, and then Ben Nevis is pretty much on most routes to John O'Groats, so I'd pass that anyway. So that then became the plan, really. Yeah, most people thought it was bonkers, but why would I add already to a very long walk by detouring several hundred miles across Wales? But yeah, that's what I decided to do.
Well, let's talk about this journey, which you have encapsulated in your book, Where Skylarks Sing. People listening will hear those birds song in the background because we're filming in a house which has a beautiful garden with lots of birds in. What specifically about Skylarks made that part of your title?
Well, a bit. I mean, skylarks are such a distinct bird, and I am not a twitcher by any stretch of the imagination, but I have a couple of friends who know their birds, and a very long time ago, I have some friends who university friends who live in Dorset, and so when a group of friends get together, all university friends get together, we often go for a walk on the coast, and I always remember one of the friends pointing out the skylarks, and they're quite small birds, and they're quite difficult to see because they fly really high, and they sing a very distinctive, melodious song that, when you're walking on cliffs. I mean, they're not just by the coast, but quite often when you're walking along cliffs, they breed in the grasses on the cliff edges or in fields nearby, and so you hear them, and it's very, very distinctive. And so as I set out on the first day, in the middle of July 2021, it was a weirdly sort of emotional start to the walk. I was delighted to be there. I was, it felt so liberating to, not least after all the COVID stuff, but all the sort of intensity of helping to care for my dad, to be, in the great outdoors. The weather was stunning that first day on the cliffs of Lizard Point. So I was incredibly, I was buoyed up and then just like punched by a whole range of emotions of what am I doing? How are my parents going to cope? Why is this a good idea? It's a bloody long way. And was really surprised by that. And I was starting to think, is it going to be like this? Is this what a long distance walk is about? Is this like every day? But I sort of gathered myself together, and then when I had, there's quite a few people walking on the coast in the summer, as you would imagine, and I felt a bit embarrassed. So I was trying to sort of hide myself away a bit behind the peak of my cap. And so when I found a spot on my own and sort of gathered myself together, I just, the skylarks were there singing really loudly, and it's just such a beautiful sound, and sort of just got me back into the sort of moment, thinking, this is stunning. This is a real privilege to be able to do this. And I guess that just spurred me on. And, you heard skylarks quite a lot throughout the journey, but on the very last day as well, when I was on the heading towards the cliffs of Dunnet Head, early on a sort of windy but sunny morning, the skylarks were singing again. And so it just sort of, I don't know, it sort of felt like something that signalled the beginning of end of a big journey, really.
I guess there's something in the sanctity of walking which allows you to really absorb the environment you're passing through, because you're going at a very slow human pace. Yeah,
there is an amazing power in walking. And I think, I've always, as a kid, my parents will tell you I hated walking. They were walkers, and I'd always complain, but clearly got the bug in my adult life. So I've always enjoyed sort of day hiking and so on, but as a way to sort of just get out, clear your head, relax a bit. But when you do that day after day, and your only focus basically is getting from A to B the way you've decided you're going to walk that day, sometimes battling the weather, whether it's heat or rain or whatever it might be, and finding something to eat, making sure you've got water, and then finding somewhere to sleep at night. It's very, very simple, essential human tasks that you've pared back life to its most simple, and it's incredibly therapeutic. And it's sort of, I mean, my mum sometimes says, if you were a kid now, you'd be diagnosed with ADHD. Now, we could have a huge debate about that I don't know if that's true, but I've always been someone my brain is always thinking about the next thing and what I'm doing and, what I should do next and how I'm going to do this and so on. But when you're out walking and you do that day after day, it's amazing how all those sort of thoughts in your own head are calmed and quietened, and how you notice things. I notice things I've never noticed before. Some people are good at this, but just, nature and wildlife and flowers and, whatever it might be. All of a sudden I found myself seeing things that I wouldn't have seen normally because my brain would be somewhere else. And that's also incredibly healing, I guess, very therapeutic. And that's what I have found with the walk, really. And
you wrote about this beautifully. If you don't mind me reading an excerpt, you said, "After weeks on the trail, I was getting better at living in the moment, of taking one step at a time. It isn't my natural state of mind, years of never-ending deadlines, of rarely having enough time to finish what needed to be done, of trying to meet unrealistic expectations, mean I can struggle genuinely to switch off, to stop the voices in my head asking what next, when, for how long, and why. But once in the open countryside, the voices are quietened, the doubts subdued, at least for a while."
Yeah. Although I'd been a day hiker, maybe that happens on a day hike for other people. I'm sure it does, because even during COVID lockdowns, I'd go for walks in the evening, and having that space was really important. But I'd never got to this stage that I got to on that walk, of that just sort of very calm, sort of relaxed state of mind, where instead of your brain being interrupted by all sorts of thoughts, that actually the only things that interrupts you are things that are around you, that are happening right there and then. And that's, it's an incredibly special place to be, actually. And indeed then is incredibly helpful in thinking about wider things, because everything in your brain is quietened down. And so things become clearer, and things that, have seemed very complicated or very difficult or very challenging I don't know, they sort of, your brain starts having the space to work out solutions. And it's an incredibly powerful thing to do.
I think you said answers are found in time. And I guess by allowing yourself the ability to slowly switch off over time, that allowed your other side of the mind to come to fruition and work out, maybe not solve problems, but work out how to process certain things in your life.
And also, I think I may just be old, but the social media world we live in, the story arc is incredibly short. The story arc is something big, quite often traumatic, happens. Somebody goes and does something else, and they find the solution to everything. And you can see hundreds and hundreds of short videos, or even longer videos on YouTube of this. And they can be really entertaining and they can be inspirational. But from my perspective, that's not real life. Few people have that perfect story arc experience, short story arc. Life is a bit more complex than that. I mean, life is a bit more nuanced than that. And I think what I learned from going on that long walk is, maybe when I started out, I sort of thought, I'm going to have these amazing, great thoughts. I'm going to solve every issue that I've ever, I've been grappling with. I'm going to find the answer to what I'm going to do for the next X period of my life. And that didn't happen. And maybe that's just my experience. But I think that's probably more similar to most people's experience than the sort of bing, this happens, now I know the answer, which we all search for, because, everybody's grappling with issues in their own lives all the time, and questions, and, things come up, family issues, whatever they may be, relationship issues, work issues, and finding a nice, easy solution would be great. But that's not actually usually what happens. And what the walk taught me, I think, is that doesn't matter, actually. it's a slow process. There are ups and downs. You'll have moments of great clarity when you think, oh, this is what I want to go and do. You'll have moments where you think, is this the right thing? Why am I doing this? Should I be doing something else? That's just what a human life is. And when I say it doesn't matter, I mean you don't have to be expecting or searching for the one answer, because there probably isn't one. Actually, life doesn't have to be have one dimension to it. There can be many dimensions. And, I like to think, having stepped away from quite a big career, that most people would say, are you mad? Why are you doing that? That actually life can be very rich by doing something completely different. And it may look really weird to other people, but, everybody doesn't have to follow the same track. And if somebody's on a track, even a track that people think, wow, people would kill to be on that track, that doesn't mean you should stay on it. You only stay on that as long as you want to be on it. And when you don't want to be on it, if you can, do something else. Why not? Our lives don't have to be really rigid. We can be flexible. And I do think what I personally found as well is, when you're in a really big, intense job, life is expensive. Life is expensive because you're time poor. I didn't have time, and there's loads of people like this. I'm not saying my situation was unique by any stretch of the imagination. There's millions of people facing this every day for various different reasons. There's families with children. There's people in very big jobs. There's people in all sorts of circumstances who are time poor. And when you're time poor, you want things to happen quickly. And that's everything from how you feed yourself to how you get about to, where you shop, all those sorts of things. And that can make life really expensive. I mean, if you're rushing between, being at work late and desperate to get enough hours of sleep before you have another busy day, you'll either go out to eat or you'll buy expensive prepackaged food because you don't want to go home. You haven't got the time to make something from scratch. If you've got to travel from A to B and you're time poor, you might, instead of walking, you might go on a train, or you might even pay for a taxi, or if you're living in a city. And all those things make life really expensive. And once you step onto another track, it's amazing how much less you need to actually live your life if you've got a bit more time. Now, that doesn't mean, it's easy necessarily, but it's been a real revelation to me. I mean, I left, having been working for the Foreign Office for 25 years with an amount of savings that I thought would last me a little bit of time. And it's amazing how you can stretch that out because you've got more time to do things differently. And I've got more time to cook, and I, not when I was on a long distance hike, obviously, where you're cooking whatever you can do in one pan on a little stove. But in life more generally, you can, that if you're doing things at a different pace and you're not in the city, life can be much simpler and less expensive, and also better for the planet probably too. So
it's a great reminder of why we should all just step outside and just go on an adventure, however big or small in life, and strip away all the complexities of our own lives that we've built up from what society puts on us, and working out actually what we really fundamentally need as a human being.
Yeah.
Which is food, water, shelter, and community. And as long as you've got all those, generally, you'll be as happy as any person who's got billions of pounds.
Yeah. And I have sometimes grappled with that because, my career allowed me to brush shoulders with some incredibly successful and wealthy folk. Whether that be senior politicians,
Drop some
businessmen.
names. Come on, drop some names.
Well, Richard Branson, Bastille the band, Jamie Cullum, all sorts of people that, day-to-day names that people would know. But the point you made about, we only have simple needs, and I totally agree with that. I mean, it was, I really do. But my point was going to be, I've sometimes grappled with it. Always is that just me consoling myself? Do I think that because I haven't got what some other people have got? But having grappled with it, I genuinely don't think that's the case. I think, I don't think I have been calmer, happier, more fulfilled than when I was on that walk and subsequent other walks, where your focus is simply on getting from A to B, having enough food, finding shelter, and then meeting people along the way and having conversations and getting to know people in a very sort of relaxed, open way without the sort of interferences and pressures that we have so often in our lives. And that's all that matters. I'd only add one thing for me, and maybe this is a personal thing. I need a goal of some sort. Maybe it's the ADHD coming back, but I lose my way a bit if I'm not focused on something, and become quite frustrated quite quickly if I feel I'm sort of wasting time. So I need a goal. But when you've got a goal of walking from A to B every day, that's brilliant, because every day you achieve something, and that's all you need. When you get to that end point, which when you're doing a long distance hike is you've found the point you're going to sleep for the night and you've got shelter. It's an amazing feeling of achievement. You've done what you set out to do that day. And when in normal life does it feel like that? Because there's always a long list of things you could have done or could be doing. But that's one of the beauties of going off on an adventure, is that's your sole focus, and you feel able to shut out everything else because that is your sole focus for that period of time, and that's incredibly powerful, I think.
That's an interesting point, actually. You comparing that lifestyle when you're on this journey, when your goal is to get to the end point, and more often than not you will get there, by whatever means. But comparing that to someone who's in a regular job, who's feeling like there's so many things going on, not only in their professional life but their personal life, that they can never accomplish enough in a day, and they constantly feel that they're never achieving and always losing out because there's just too much pressure on ourselves. We live in a world now where things are so easily accessible to us because of the internet and devices that we use, that rather than making our lives easier, they actually make them harder because we now feel that we can do more. Yeah. And I think what is so important for anyone who feels stuck in that situation is actually when you are feeling like you're not able to achieve stuff in life, cross out so much of anything that you want to achieve. Really strip back and work out what is at the real core of what you really want to do and be, and get rid of everything else. And don't stress about not doing those, because if you just focus on the core fundamentals and you've reduced that to a very, very small list, then it becomes achievable. And then you can celebrate that more often, rather than feeling like you're always on the back foot.
Yeah, I'd wish I'd known that when I was in the Foreign Office, I have to say, because I wasn't good at that. I was, it always felt like there was more to do. I mean, having had the experience of 3 long distance walks now, but particularly this one across the UK, I think, you learn through that process that by paring back and focusing on, because you have to on an adventure, what you've actually got to do that day, that's, incredibly rewarding. And you can apply that to life more generally. I mean, I have, long lists of things that I want to be doing and need to be doing. But, at the beginning of a day, I write the 3 or 4 things I want to do that day. And I try and be because my natural tendency is put loads on it, and then you never finish. Well, that's not, it's not very healthy. So I try and focus down to, what am I likely to be able to do today, and what's key to be done today, and that really helps. And I think if you're in those, like so many people in intense work situations or home life situations, that, carving out just a little bit of time for yourself is really, really important. I mean, oddly, COVID was quite significant for me in this because I ended up in a caravan in my parents' garden helping to care for my dad, and you couldn't do anything else. I thought, I'm going to need time for me. I'm going to need space for me. Otherwise, this is not going to work. This is going to go horribly wrong. And so I went for walks almost every day. And it might only have been half an hour, 45 minutes and stuff. But that was a revelation as well, because, I am very, very guilty of this. When working, you just get completely consumed by work. I mean, I'll give you an example in Washington. It was a very, very busy job. I mean, I'd be in the office at my desk before 8 o'clock in the morning. I'd rarely leave my desk until 6:30. But I was only leaving at that time because I was then going to some evening event that I needed to be at. Quite often during the week, I wouldn't be at home before 9, 10, sometimes 11 o'clock at night. And then I'd be looking at my emails in case I've missed anything. And then you go to bed and you get up and start again. So, and then at the weekend, because, as you say, technology just means we're overloaded all the time, I'd have loads and loads of emails, hundreds and hundreds of emails that I hadn't got round to looking at because you're never you're always busy doing meetings and not hosting visitors or whatever it might be, out and about, meeting Americans. And I'd think, I'll spend a few hours and I'll get on top of this. And I'd start early on a Saturday morning, and by 6 or 7 o'clock on a Saturday evening, I'd got a third of the way through the emails. And then I realised, you're not going to get on top of this. Get a life, switch off. And Sunday, usually I'd manage to, but I never learned. I did it every weekend. I'd just be, really, frustrating with myself, but because you just think, I need to get on top of this, because if I'm not on top of it, when I start work on Monday, it's just going to be awful. But you never get on top of it. So the only way is we have to consciously carve out time, because those, if you don't see all your emails, somebody will email again if it's important, ultimately. Somebody will call again if they really need something from you. But it took me a long time to learn that.
I want to bring you back to your book. It's beautifully written.
Thank you.
You, I've obviously walked this journey, and so much of your book is you carving this path through the United Kingdom, and your descriptions of it are so beautifully written. You can tell you're a very good writer. Even at the start, I know that section of Cornwall really well, so I was reminiscing about all these different viewpoints that I've had from my own personal experience, and I loved kind of hearing kind of your perspective on it as well. I want to bring our attention to one place in the book, on your journey, in let me get this right, in Llanidloes. I'm not going to correct you. In Llanidloes.
Sounds about right.
In Wales.
Yeah.
At the Taladig Bakery.
Yeah.
Tell me about your experience there.
Yeah. It's one of so many experiences across the walk, I guess, of just the incredible kindness of strangers. I was walking for Alzheimer's research. I was wearing an Alzheimer's research t-shirt, but rather frustratingly, the sort of branding of the t-shirt sat under the straps of my backpack. So people were hard pressed to realise unless we got talking. But it was a bit of a wet, sort of miserable sort of day. I didn't have the greatest weather in the middle of Wales, it has to be said. And I walked into this small town. And Central Wales is one of the least populated places in the whole of the country. It's not far behind the sort of the islands of Scotland. I mean, it's pretty deserted and beautiful too. And I came into this little town and in the rain and just walked into the bakery in search of food, of course, because, anybody who knows it, when you do a long distance hike, food is very, very often on your mind because it's really hard to put in enough calories.
And you never know when you're going to get it.
And you never know when you're going to get it. I mean, and you never know if the little town you're walking through is actually going to have a shop. I mean, you can Google, of course, but, they're not often accurate. And I've had a fair few experiences of, oh, brilliant, there's a little shop here. Oh, that shop that says it's the local store actually only sells greeting cards and newspapers. I can't eat those. And so on. So I walked into this place and just into this little bakery and got chatting to the woman serving. And she spotted my T-shirt and she said, oh, you're collecting for Alzheimer's research. And she was a dementia, I can't remember what the term is now, dementia friend. Yeah, that's right. Dementia friend where, I think it's the Dementia UK sort of give a little training to people in the service sector so they might recognise people with dementia and know how to, handle people who may be a bit confused or whatever it might be. And the reason she'd done this is because her grandmother had Alzheimer's, and so she'd seen it firsthand. And so she was sort of said, right, I need to get my mum. And she disappeared out of the shop before I could do anything. And the thing about this for me is having been in being in the diplomatic world where it's an amazing, brilliant job, but you're a public figure. You're on, when you're abroad, not in the UK, but when you're abroad in an embassy, you're a public figure. I mean, people come, I was number 2 in our embassy in Washington. I had a big house because I needed to put people up and entertain and so on. So you're constantly on show. And so on this walk, the last thing I wanted was to sort of be on show, if you like. I didn't want to, feel myself a celebrity or anything. So anyway, the woman dashed out. Next minute, her mum turns up, who's a local councillor and also local business owner. Really, really impressive woman who's sort of runs the local bakery. She bought the local newsagent. Then when the local barbers was folding, she invested in that. So the community still had local services. And this huge bundle of energy turned up and was like, I need to go and get the mayor. And I'm like, no, please don't go and get the mayor. I'll go over to the hotel. They must give you a bed. No, it's okay. I'm camping. And they were just absolutely delightful. And then, they put a collection box on their countertop for people coming to the shop, and they donated several £100s to my walk. Once I'd finished the money they'd collected, just a wonderful example of human kindness, really, and how something that was repeated so many times across the country, and also another example of how many people are affected by Alzheimer's. I mean, I knew it was widespread. I knew that, there are hundreds of thousands of people, more probably, suffering from the disease in this country. But I was still really taken aback about, every day I'd bump into people and get chatting and they'd say, oh yeah, my dad had that, or my mum had that, my mum got this early onset, or everybody had a story. And that was, it was quite shocking that it was so widespread. But, we sort of touched on this before. I mean, in the sense that, I stepped away from the Foreign Office partly because of my dad and his diagnosis and needing to be around more, partly because I didn't feel comfortable in working on certain things for the government and Britain itself. I mean, I'd spent all my career promoting this country and promoting everything it stood for abroad. And, we have a very good reputation, broadly speaking, abroad. We're a pragmatic, sensible, problem-solving sort of country that, gets involved in the big issues of the day. We're, broadly successful economically and so on. So all those are, we try and advance human rights and all that sort of stuff. And yet, in sort of recent years, we seem to be becoming more polarized, more at war with ourselves, less confident, more inward-looking, and that felt incredibly alien to me. And having spent 5 years up until 2018 abroad, I sort of felt a little bit like an alien in my own country, really. Would it? And then I went on this walk, and then you realise that the vast majority of people in this country are kind, decent, smart, caring, and the number of experiences I had like that Taladig bakery in Llanidloes was amazing, really.
Yeah, it shows the importance of just having real conversation, real connections, and listening to people.
Yeah, it comes down to time again, I guess.
Right.
In the sense that, yes, I was on a big walk, and so that sort of was key to the conversations that I had. But it's also, again, we rush around. We don't connect. I think everybody is so busy that you run into a store and you run out again, and you dip into here and dip into that, and few people have got the time even for the sort of a tiny conversation with people, and that's when that's what restores your faith in humanity.
Yeah, everything can feel very transactional in our relationships. Yeah. You wrote about the experience in great length, and near the end you said, "I made my way up to the valley, to the campsite, more convinced than ever that home is not just bricks and mortar or even a single location. It's about relationships and community. Most of all, it's a state of mind, an intangible feeling of belonging, of well-being. Many people might find home where they were born or grew up, where they first settled after getting married. For others, perhaps me, it could be found on the road, on a journey by accepting life as a nomad."
Yeah. I mean, I've always wanted to get out and about and go different places. And I really, in a way, don't know where that comes from. Do we ever know? But, my dad grew up and worked in the same village until they moved after his retirement, sort of 60 odd years later. He was in the same place. I mean, they had a caravan when we were kids and we went out and about. So maybe that's part of it. But I always knew that once I left school, and indeed I went to university and left university, I was going to go and sort of look at other places and travel and indeed see other parts of the world. And I guess that's why I ended up applying for in the Foreign Office, which just reinforced that interest. So it's a double-edged sword, because when you're in a career like diplomacy, you're constantly moving. You have a couple of years in London, then you'll move to another country, and you may be there 2, 3, 4 years. You move back again, and then you move off again. So you do lose out on that sort of community that people build if they've stayed in the same place. And I think as I say, that's why I say it's a double-edged sword. But then you also gain all the experiences of seeing so many different parts of the world and building different communities there. So I think I'm never going to be a person who sits still in one place. I think that's just not me. And that's why I think I sometimes think I should, that's normal. That's what, most people do. Most people, they settle down, they have a family, they base themselves they might move a couple of times, but, they're basically anchored in a location. But that's never been me. And, again, going on that walk and having the time to just sort of detach yourself from everything made me realize that that's okay. And actually, maybe I will find somewhere and settle and put anchors down, but maybe I won't. And it actually doesn't matter. It's, you know, why do we question that? We only question it because society, I guess, says this is what people do. We don't have to. So,
how long was your journey in total at the end?
73 days walking, but you know, I took the odd, you know, every 10 days or so I took a rest day or a planning day to work out where I was going next. So yeah, I started in mid-July and I finished in early October. So,
and as you carved through the landscape of the United Kingdom, crossing through different counties and obviously England, Wales and Scotland, what did you get a sense of society, or what did you learn about the UK along that way?
Well, first and foremost, that, you know, it's a beautiful country. It really is. I mean, even in some poor weather, mid Wales, parts of Scotland, I mean, it's still a beautiful country when you're out in nature, and you know, as long as you've got a coat and you've got somewhere to get dry, it really doesn't matter. But you know, there's the obvious bits that are stunning. I mean, the southwest coast, Devon and Cornwall. I mean, it's gobsmackingly gorgeous. I mean, I was really lucky that I had good weather. In fact, it was too hot. It was a heat wave at times, but which makes walking quite tough. But I mean, it's just absolutely stunning. And I was doing this in July, July down in the southwest, the height of the high season, where so many more people were staycationing because of, you know, COVID restrictions, and yet, you know, okay, you'd walk down into a cove and it's heaving. You walk up the cliffs and walk half a mile. There's nobody there. It's amazing, and you'd be on your own. And I mean, you'd pass other walkers, but you know, not busy. And so yeah, the obvious places are stunning, and they really are. But I guess again, when you slow down to this, you know, you slow down your pace so much. It's how places that I really didn't expect would be beautiful were really lovely places. And even in places, you know, some of carving your way through the northwest in some of the sort of, you know, decaying industrial parts of the world, I really didn't expect. I sort of thought, oh well, it'll be head down walking through these until I get to the next nice place in the Lake District. But actually, you know, I mean, I clearly wasn't walking unless I really had to, walking through big towns and cities. You know, you're in the countryside. But there are stunning places, even where you don't expect them to be. I mean, between walking through the northwest, so between sort of Warrington and you get to sort of Wigan and in Lancashire, there's huge wetland and areas that have that are basically rehabilitated sinkholes. The land has subsided because they built all these mines to dig up coal, and it's all sunk and made these lakes. And now it's turned into a nature reserve, and it's a breeding ground for rare birds and stuff like that. And you're within spitting distance of some sort of, you know, pretty urban areas, and yet, wow, it's like these are real sort of gems of outdoor spaces that are right on people's doorsteps. And so that was a revelation too, is, you know, there are lots of places you don't expect are going to be nice that actually are beautiful in their own way.
And front and centre of your journey, you were visiting pubs, restaurants, cafes. This was coming out of COVID, but also in the time of post-Brexit. And then you've talked about some of your views about Brexit, but what did you experience and see as a result of what was happening along that journey in real life?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I'd say was, I mean, one of the reasons I set out to walk was to try and, you know, having been abroad a lot and all the politics that was going on in this country, to try and sort of reconnect to the UK and you know, get to know a country that I'd represented abroad a lot, but not been present in that often myself over the years. And that was a really positive experience from the people you meet, and reassuring that, despite the politics and the noise you hear on the news and social media, that actually, fundamentally people are good and kind. And so that was really helpful and reassuring. But there's also, I didn't set out to write a book about Brexit, and I hope I haven't. But
no, I mean it's so much of your journey, but there's some of that in there. There's very small amounts, but
it's because it was impossible to avoid, and it was a bit of a shock to me at how the impact of Brexit was already so visible, and it was visible mainly in the fact that so many places I went to. So bearing in mind, this is after COVID, where the service sector has been closed down and has had a really, really hard time. And indeed, many businesses folded. So this is when they can just start reopening again in summer 2021. And those service sector industries needed to have a good season because they'd had a very hard 18 months. They needed to recoup losses, pay off debts, get the business going back again. And yet, so many of them were either working part-time, not opening at all, because they couldn't get the staff, because Brexit meant that European seasonal workers could no longer come to the UK, and therefore bars, restaurants, cafes, etc. I mean, I went to pub, in search of food when you can get it. I went into pubs in search of food, and they weren't serving at lunchtime because they could only do one service a day because they didn't have enough staff. I went to places where cafes had just not reopened, and on the glass of the door there was an apologetic notice saying, "We're going to open 3 days a week because that's all we can get staff for. We're really sorry." I stayed on a campsite where the man and his wife who were running the campsite were almost on their knees because they hadn't been able to recruit cleaning staff to clean their static caravans that they rented out for the summer holiday period. They weren't even sure whether they were going to have to make cancellations because they couldn't keep on top of it because they couldn't get the staff. So I was quite shocked at how sort of immediate that impact was. And so, I do write about it a bit in the book, and it, clearly from my own viewpoint, it reinforced my sense that this was the wrong thing to do. And other people don't have that view, but it was front and center. And even in places, when I got to places that weren't that touristy, I thought it wouldn't be the issue. The issue would go away because those areas wouldn't rely on seasonal staff as much. But even in places that really aren't very touristy, the same thing was happening. And I'm like, wow, okay. I talked to somebody in Cornwall, and it was like the farmers can't get people to pick crops in their field, and so they're just going to waste in the field. So, it was there to see. And then when you get to sort of northern Scotland, which of course has a very short season really because of the weather. So, the summer season is probably July to September, June to September in parts of Scotland, and that's it. That's when they have to make their money if you're a tourist-related service industry. And they were having the same problem too. Lots of places just weren't open. And I think things have got better over time. The people have, obviously businesses have had to work their way around it, but that in that immediate aftermath, because of course Brexit properly started early 2021, that's when everything was implemented and we had left. The impact was immediate and not good if you're a service sector industry.
Did you ever get better at cooking camping food yourself? You wrote about boiling rice and tipping a can of salmon in. Did that ever evolve?
Not particularly.
It's always hard when you're on your own, I think, to put in the effort to do a good meal with very limited and small cooking utensils.
Yeah, and you've got to carry everything, of course, and so it's quite difficult to do anything particularly fresh. But so what I do, when you find a little shop, I'd buy fruit and I'd eat it. so I didn't have to carry it. So your meal times become a bit sort of fluid, really. But in terms of those evening meals camping, actually, because you're so hungry, because you've walked for miles carrying a heavy backpack, really doesn't matter what you eat. Everything tastes wonderful. That's also a revelation. So I would buy, packs of rice and heat them up a bit, and maybe if I was being exotic, put a tin of tuna in it, or maybe some sweaty cheese that I'd had in my backpack getting too hot.
You just become creative with what you have.
Creative, and then when you find another shop, you buy salad. But I had one night actually where I was in a small town in southern Scotland, and there was an Aldi or something, or a Lidl, and in the town, and I went in, and it was the end of the day, so they had all sorts of things on, sell off bargains like raspberries and salad. And I thought, brilliant, fresh fruit and vegetables. And I had a bit of fish, I think, and that's what I ate for dinner. The next day, it was awful because I'd eaten lots, but there was so little calories in it, I think, is what I worked out. Because, salad leaves and a bit of fruit and so on. I hadn't put enough in myself. And so I felt like somebody was almost pulling me back that day, because until I could find a shop and refill again. So yeah, there's a real challenge sometimes in pushing in calories when you're burning constantly so much. And it's funny because at the beginning, right at the beginning in Cornwall, I didn't find that at all. I was fine. I was eating a little bit more than normal, but not a lot. But then it got sort of 3 weeks in, and I was ravenous all the time. And I think it's because, we all from day-to-day life get a little bit of extra padding or a bit of comfort space. And I'd burnt all that off. And so my body's saying, if you're going to get me to do stuff, you're going to have to feed me. And then you just become a food machine, basically. So
one of Sean Conway's tips when he was doing his 102 iron distance triathlons in 102 days is he would just down a tub of cream purely to get the calories in, because he didn't want to lose body weight. I wouldn't recommend that on an adventure, but I mean, I always believe in just bread is such a good carb.
Yep.
And always have bread on you, because that's also something that's going to satisfy that kind of that energy demand.
Yeah, and you can crush bread in your rucksack and it's still nice and edible. It's true. Yeah. And it's why walking in somewhere like France is brilliant, because you just shove a baguette down the side of your rucksack,
and they're the best baguettes in the world.
And they're
I've toured France on bike, and we lived by all the bakeries. Yeah, fresh croissants in the morning. Exactly. The most amazing baguettes. I'm going off topic now, but the British, we don't do baguettes. They're not baguettes here. I don't know what they are in supermarkets. No. They're not real bread. You don't really realise how good baguettes can be when you actually...
Well, it's one of those things that they're making them every day in little bakeries in every town in France, pretty much. And so I'm sure there's lots of great bakeries in the UK who do great baguettes. Of course there are. Yeah. We mentioned the Llanidloes bakery in Llanidloes already.
Absolutely. You struggled a lot with your feet on the journey. You wrote in depth about your experience with that. First of all, having blisters early on, and that continued, but then also your indecision of which insoles to get caused you problems. It's probably anyone's kind of worst nightmare for going on a long distance journey is actually how their feet can cope and the pain that can cause.
Yeah. So, we talked a little bit about how, I did this all quite quickly. I came to the decision and then set off walking like a month later. And so I didn't have that much time to plan. So the one thing I did do is thought I need a pair of walking boots that are going to last. I didn't want. So what my thought process was, halfway through this walk, I don't want to have to break in a second pair of walking boots. So I need something durable, solid. So I decided to buy some leather walking boots, and I did a couple of weeks before I set out, and they were lovely and comfortable in the shop. they were lovely and comfortable on the couple of short walks I did in them before I started, but then put a weight on your back and do triple or quadruple the length of walking and throw in a heat wave.
And hills.
And hills. And they quickly became extremely uncomfortable. And I developed blisters pretty much everywhere. And then I thought, so I had an issue with the insoles in the walking boots slipping around a bit. So I thought, well, logic, that must be why, these boots are rubbing, because the insoles aren't staying in place. So I went into a little shop and bought some new insoles, and I bought padded insoles because I thought, that'd be really nice and it's a bit more sponge under your feet. Because you can, at the end of a long day on like a rocky cliff, you really start feeling the sort of rocks under your feet. And that turned out to be a massive mistake, because all I'd done was squeezed my feet into my boots even more, so there was less space for them, and then I got even more blisters. And I even now I sort of think it was only blisters. Why are you such a wuss? But actually, they were agonizingly painful. Particularly starting off in the morning when you've sort of, you've had your boots off overnight in your sleeping bag and you've got to squeeze them back into a pair of walking boots and set off. Yeah, that was hard going. And for about a few days in the middle of Devon, it was really, really unpleasant, to the point where, without sounding melodramatic, that it was mind over matter. I mean, I just literally had to try and block out as much as I could of the pain and just get on with it. And I tried listening to music, and that worked for a little bit because I might sing along to things I knew, but then, it doesn't distract you because the pain is so great. So, I mean, that was the only time, I have to say, when I thought I might not finish this walk. And I was really annoyed with myself for, why did I think not breaking in walking boots was a good idea? Why had I bought new insoles that were more cushioned that, clearly had caused even more trouble? But, I suppose you learn by making mistakes. And so after that, I sort of religiously, once my feet started to heal, which is probably in week 3 or something, I religiously taped anywhere on my feet that might blister for weeks and weeks. I think I was in mid-Scotland before I thought, no, your feet are probably all right now. And of course they were, because they'd got used to the boots. The boots had shaped around my feet. My feet had hardened, and I probably could have done that weeks before, but I was so paranoid that I was not going to have this happen again.
But that tape helped in that short term initially. Was that a genuine solution to what was?
Well, I now know, actually. I mean, first and foremost, break in your walking boots a bit before you go on a walk, particularly if you've bought leather walking boots. So wear them a few times. So the 2 subsequent walks I've done in France the last couple of years, I've made sure I haven't been in brand new boots. But taping actually really does help. It's
what kind of tape is this?
So if you just use like
kinesthetic tape, is it?
The sort of stuff that that sort of orangey coloured tape that you can wrap around muscle injury and stuff like that. Yeah, if you put that on your heels and toes that might rub, basically you learn after the fact. But blisters are caused by friction and heat usually. So your feet get hot because you're walking and you're exerting yourself. And then your skin is rubbing against the inside of the boots, and that friction creates the blister. And so if you can take away that friction point or protect those friction points by some tape, it doesn't stop them completely all the time, but makes a massive difference. And you only typically need to do that, I have found, for a couple of weeks, because your feet get used to your boots and your feet harden, and then you can stop doing it. It's a lifesaver at the beginning of a long walk.
Yeah, it's quite a good tool to have, actually, I think, on any adventure. It's going to help your body, but also tape in general. It's just a handy thing to have when you're out in the elements. Who knows what you might need to tape up.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Tears in equipment.
And if something can have multi-purpose, it means you bring less of something.
Yeah.
I'm going to close things, but I guess you've obviously you might have inspired someone to go for a long walk in their life. But I guess what does it take to actually make that big leap to actually do it?
I mean, in my own case, I guess it was a set of circumstances, some of which you don't wish upon anybody, given my dad's condition. But
do you also believe, because you talked about how as your dad's condition worsened, there became a point where you didn't want it to reach this critical point where it would cause him harm for him to go into care? And is it also the same that could be said that we shouldn't have to wait for something in our lives to happen for us to actually stop and bring everything back to basics and go out on an adventure?
Oh yeah, I was about to make the same point. I sort of in my own case, there was a set of circumstances, some of which, as I say, I wouldn't wish upon anybody, that led me to a point where I thought this is a good idea. And I'd encourage anybody to get out there. And I know I've been in a privileged position to go off and spend 3 months doing this, and subsequently several weeks on a couple of walks in France over the last 2 years. But it doesn't have to be that long. People don't have to, you can go out for a couple of hours. People can go out for an adventure for a couple of days. People can go for a week as a holiday for them. It was such a revelation to me how powerful going on an adventure was for me personally, that I'd encourage anybody to get out and do it. And it doesn't have to be walking. If cycling is your thing, it can be cycling. If kayaking is your thing, it can be kayaking. But go out and get on. And the I guess the only thing I'd say is anybody can do this. I mean, I'm not an athlete. I never was. I'm not, superhuman. I consider myself to be a pretty normal, regular sort of person who just went out and tried something. And, I wouldn't say you can do that. If you want to climb Everest, you can do that. I wouldn't say if you want to go and scuba dive incredibly deep, you can do it without, obviously certain things need expertise and training and support. But going out on a walk, anybody can do. And, carrying a pack, anybody can do. Because you can regulate how far you go. You learn along the way that I started off with a pack which was much too heavy, even though I thought I'd been really ruthless. I learned very quickly that I needed to be more ruthless if I was gonna make it, and so ditched a lot of stuff and kept the real essentials. And so with something like walking, you just adjust. And at the beginning, I might have been doing 10 or 15 miles, and by the end I was doing 25 on some days, or even longer on a couple of crazy days. But your body gets used to it, you adapt, and it's amazing what you can get your body to do if you put your mind to it. But as I say, that's not from somebody who's ever been an athlete or particularly outdoorsy at all. That's from somebody who was always the last person to be picked on a sports team at school, because I wasn't, I was the academic-y type. I wasn't the sporty type. So, really anybody can do this. And the numbers of times people say, well, to me, how did you do that? I know I could never do that. It's like, it's not true. It is just not true. We all can, if we want to, if we put our mind to it. And I mean, the danger, of course, is it's addictive. And, once you've started doing these adventures, it's quite hard to stop. So who knows what my next one will be.
Well, that definitely seems like a great advert for someone to go do it, knowing that it's not like, oh, this was a horrible experience, I'm never doing it again. Actually, no, it changed my life and I'm going to go do more. And that's always a positive experience to have.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I've loved the conversation. I will link your book below, and I hope more people will enjoy and get inspired by it. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in. If you want to find out more information about any of the guests, please check out the show notes, where you'll also find links to things mentioned in the conversation. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please take a look through the past recordings. There's so many more incredible stories for you to find, and I can't wait for you to enjoy them. Thank you.